Welcome to the North Idaho College Public Forum. It is my pleasure today to welcome to our program Dr. Duane T. Gish. Please allow me to give you his background. Dr. Gish received a Bachelor of Science degree with a major in chemistry from UCLA in the year 1949. He also was elected to the UCLA chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. Following that degree, he attended the University of California at Berkeley, receiving a PhD in the field of biochemistry in 1953. Upon completion of the PhD from 1953 to 1955, he was a Lilly postdoctoral fellow in the natural sciences at Cornell University Medical College in New York City. Also in the year 1956, he held the position of assistant professor of biochemistry at that institution. Upon completion of that work, in 1956, in the fall, Dr. Gish joined the research staff of the virus laboratory at the University of California in Berkeley. While there, he worked in research in the field area of virus research. From 1960 until 1971, Dr. Gish was a member of the research staff of the Upjohn Company located in Kalamazoo, Michigan. In 1971, he resigned that position to go to the state of California and took the position as Associate Director of the Institute for Creation Research. In that particular capacity, he has worked in the area of studying scientific evidence related to the question of creation versus evolution theory. Ladies and gentlemen, he's going to be with us today on this program to answer the questions of three panel members on the issue of human evolution versus human creation. Dr. Gish is also the author of a book entitled Evolution, The Fossils Say No. Dr. Gish, it's a pleasure having you on our program.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's my pleasure to be here with you today.
It is also my privilege today to welcome three professors from North Idaho College that will be quizzing our guests. To my far left is Richard Snyder, who has a BA degree from California State University in Northridge, California. He also holds an MA degree from UCLA, both degrees in the field of anthropology. At this time, Mr. Snyder teaches anthropology at North Idaho College. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Tony. I'm glad to be here.
It's also a privilege to welcome to the panel Doug McLean, who holds a BS degree from California Institute of Technology and also a MS degree from the University of Idaho, both degrees in the field of physics, and he teaches on the faculty at North Idaho College in the field of physics. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tony.
And it's also my privilege to my immediate left to welcome James Burns, who is a chairman of the Division of Biological Sciences at North Idaho College, teaching in the field of biology. He holds a BS degree and an MS degree from the University of Idaho in the fields of zoology. Welcome to the program.
I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk to Dr. Gish.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first series of questions from Richard Snyder.
Dr. Gish, I have here a brochure from the Institute for Creation Research located in San Diego, California, I believe it is. Would you tell us something about the Institute and what the Institute's goals are? And if I'm not mistaken, you're the Associate Director. Perhaps you could tell us something about it.
That's right, Mr. Snyder. The Institute for Creation Research is a division of Christian Heritage College, which is a Christian liberal arts college in San Diego, California. The Institute is a nonprofit organization that was formed for the purpose of conducting research into all phases of this question of creation evolution, and then to make this information known through publications, seminars, various speaking engagements of this kind, and through a series of books and so forth, and television, radio, various means of making the results of this research known. So its basic purpose then is to make known the scientific credibility of the creationist position.
Would you say something about the staff?
Well, our staff, our director is Dr. Henry Morris, who for many years was the chairman of the Civil Engineering Department at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute. Dr. Morris's specialty is in hydraulics. His degree was in hydraulics, PhD from Minnesota, and with a minor in geology. The two of us at the present time, well, in addition to our full-time staff, we have Professor Harold Slusher from the University of Texas El Paso, a physicist who works with us a considerable amount of the time, and we will very soon we'll be joined by two other members, a man who holds a PhD in biology, and then a man who is presently Director of Science Education for one of the largest school districts in the state of Wisconsin. These people will be joining us. So we have at the present time a small staff, scientific staff of the Institute.
Doug McLean.
What is a creationist, Dr. Gish?
I beg pardon?
What is a creationist?
A creationist is one who believes that the universe and the living things that it contains came into being by the direct acts of a creator, which is God. Of course, I believe is God the creator. The general creation model, we merely refer to a creator. We take the position of what is known as spatial creation. That is, we believe that creation involves spatial processes which are not in operation today. This is a position, of course, which is, you might say, opposite to that of an evolutionist, at least the evolutionist who believes that the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of living things can be accounted for by mechanistic, naturalistic processes which could be ascribed to properties inherent in matter. We take the position that the facts of science demonstrate that not only did the universe have a creator, but its origin would have required a creator.
James Burns.
You know, I like, Dr. Gish, I always think it's good to define certain variables here. You define what a creationist is. I would like to know what your definition of evolution is in terms so we'll have something to work with. What is an evolutionist?
Well, I think it's very, very good that we do have these definitions established so we're not confused because we really don't understand each other. By evolution, I am referring to the general theory of evolution. This is the theory that our universe, life itself, and all living things have arisen or come into being by naturalistic, mechanistic processes which can be ascribed to properties that are inherent in matter. In other words, matter had an inherent ability to self-organize itself and to self-transform itself from some previous disorganized, chaotic state into an organized state, such that our universe itself came into being, the solar system arose, life arose from the inanimate, and from this first primeval cell, all living things have arisen. This is what is often called the general theory of evolution. Sometimes it's called the particles to people theory, and I even call it the fish to Gish theory of evolution. So we are speaking about something that goes beyond mere change, but this is a kind of change that we are referring to by evolution.
Well, I have some question with that definition. What I've learned in my definition of evolution and what I operate under is that evolution had merely changed through time, and that evolution and the origin of life are two separate things, whereas the origin of life is definitely a theory at this particular time. In evolution, we consider evolution to be a fact from the evidence that we have. So in operation of my definition of evolution, it would be simply change through time. That time could be short or it could be quite long, depending upon what you're looking at.
Well, Mr. Burns, if we are defining evolution as merely change through time, then we are all evolutionists, because obviously change does take place. But the question is, does the kind of change postulated by the general theory of evolution, that is, primitive cell to man, has these kind of changes occurred? Has a process of change that has resulted in this vast evolutionary scheme, has this taken place? Now, I think that's the basic question. I think that's what we're discussing this afternoon. Certainly, I believe in genetic change, in that mutations do occur, and of course the next generation of the human race is going to have a different assortment of genes than the present. My children have a different assortment than I do. But the question that concerns us today, I believe, are there changes occurring in the present world and in the past that have allowed this what we might say amoeba to man evolution.
Dr. Gish, do you feel then that you can separate the 2 points, the origin of life and the evolution that occurs afterward, from each other?
Well, of course, we can consider evolution in its various phases: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and then the origin of living things from that first primeval cell. Now, there are some who are theistic evolutionists, perhaps, who say, well, God created the first cell, but I believe from then on it had this capability of evolving into man. There are others, such as Julian Huxley, totally mechanistic, who, of course, embraces this evolutionary continuum from the Big Bang or wherever we started all the way to man. Huxley, for example, has said that our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. So it just depends upon what view of evolution is taken or assumed by the individual.
Well, in reading your book, then, I understand your basic premise is then that its evolution as being changed through time is all right, but what your premise is that the major categories of the animal phyla were created separately. The birds were created, the mammals were created, the invertebrates were created, and the large categories were created, and then within these phyla, speciation occurred.
Well, actually, it goes beyond the phyla. For example, within the reptiles, we believe that the turtles, the crocodiles, snakes, and lizards are basically different created kinds. We believe, however, the evidence indicates that there has been some variation within the limits or boundaries of the kinds. We always point to the example of the dogs. We see that within the mongrel dog there was a considerable variability. There was a sufficient gene pool or genetic potential to allow the origin of the various breeds of dogs. The genes were there, and man has utilized this variability to derive these various breeds of dogs. And beyond that, the dog, Canis familiaris, will interbreed on occasion with coyotes and wolves. They are interfertile. And therefore it seems reasonable to us that the original created dog kind, if we can call it that, had a sufficient genetic potential or gene pool that allowed this limited variation. Today we have wolves, dogs, and coyotes. What we are saying, we do not believe there is any evidence in the present world or in the past that cats and dogs have arisen from common ancestors, that flying reptiles evolved from non-flying reptiles, or man from some lower creature.
Mr. Snyder.
Dr. Gish, in your book you make reference on page 25 to divine creation, and you state God used processes which are not now operating anywhere in the natural universe, unquote. What were those processes, and how do you know that they're not now operating?
Well, we know that they're not operating today because we do not see species or anything like that being created de novo. Our point is this, that the whole subject of origins, whether by evolution or creation, is outside of the limits of empirical science. I'm sure we all realize that however these events occurred, that no one saw the origin of the universe, no one has seen life arise from an inanimate world, and no one has ever seen any living thing come into being. So, and even in the present world, of course, as I mentioned, we do not see creation occurring today, and even if evolution were occurring, it would take tens of thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, to produce the kind of change necessary to validate or document the general theory of evolution. So our contention is that the whole subject of origins is beyond the limits of empirical science. Scientifically, we cannot test either creation or evolution. But we do think it is possible to establish a level of confidence or credibility in one versus the other. And we believe that when all the scientific evidence is carefully evaluated, that the concept of direct creation is more credible, can be given more confidence than the concept of evolution.
Mr. McLean.
When you use the words nowhere in the universe, the astronomers assure us that new stars are being formed in the cloud of Orion and the Pleiades, and that some of these stars will have planetary systems. Do you think that they're going to be forever barren of life?
Well, first let me say this, that astronomers, evolutionists, have theories about the origin of stars and so forth, but no one has ever seen anything like this happen. No one has ever seen a star come into being. We have seen supernova, we have seen stars explode, we have seen these degenerative processes, but we have no empirical evidence that stars do form. No one has ever seen anything like this. And so while there is this theory that this does happen, there is no real evidence. No one has ever seen it happen. As a matter of fact, we find that the theory of a formation of a star actually presents some tremendous problems to the physicist. As you know, probably know, the formation of a star would require the gravitational collapse of gas and dust, or at least of a gas. But this gravitational forces are opposed by the internal gas pressure. At all times, the gas pressure would exceed the gravitational attraction unless there were some event nearby, such as a supernova perhaps, or some other event like that, which would then allow the gravitational forces to overcome this internal gas pressure. But you see, that does not explain how stars could have formed in the very beginning.
Yes, I think what you're referring to is the lack of dust in the original cloud. But there are plenty of dust available now. The dust has to be available for the heat to radiate away to let the gas pressure drop. And there's lots of dust visible now, as you can see at night, looking at the Milky Way anytime.
Yes. Let me just, on this very point, I might quote from an article published recently in Scientific American. This is the September 1975 issue of Scientific American. There's an article in this particular issue, by the way, which is devoted completely to the origin of the solar system, the nature and origin of the solar system. This particular article is by Dr. A.G.W. Cameron on the origin of evolution of the solar system. And speaking of the formation of a star, he says, for example, gravitational forces tend to pull such a cloud into a more compact configuration. Contraction is opposed, however, by the internal pressure of the gas in the cloud, which tends to make the cloud expand. Ordinarily, the internal pressure is much stronger than the gravitation, and the cloud is in no danger of collapsing. Sometimes, however, a sudden fluctuation in pressure from a nearby violent event, such as a supernova explosion, the formation of a massive star, or a large rearrangement of the interstellar magnetic field, may compress a cloud to a density much higher than normal. Under such conditions, which are quite rare, gravity may win out over internal pressure so that the cloud begins to collapse to form stars, unquote. Now, this then is supposed to explain how a star forms. But the important thing is here that this theory, you see, requires a pre-existing universe. Yes, you can't have a supernova without a star in existence or an interstellar magnetic event. It does not explain, you see, how in the beginning, in the absence of any such effects, these clouds could have collapsed to form stars. And we believe it's physically impossible.
Well, there are quite a few theories that go back to the origin, and there's much controversy here. But the point is, there is plenty of supernovas going off in our galaxy and other galaxies today. There's plenty of dust to explain the collapse of smaller clouds, such as those seen in the Orion Nebula right today. It is believed these are collapsing into stars, and there have been supernovas there that would explain this.
Yes, I realize these theories have been proposed, but as yet we have not seen anything like this take place.
Well, we've only been looking for 50 years.
That's right. But science is what we know, you see, and what we have observed. Now, if we should see something like this happen, then we would have empirical evidence. But until we do see something like that happen. We do not have any empirical evidence.
James Burns.
Dr. Gish, a lot of people that oppose evolution imply evolution is a chain type of evolution. They're always saying missing links and so forth, which would imply a chain type of evolution. Well, I think most people are in agreement that evolution is not a simple chain, but it was a bush-like pattern of which there were many contemporary species that were evolved at about the same time and went off in separate directions. How would you answer to that? Do you feel it's a chain type of evolution? I noticed in your example on the horse, it was implied that this horse evolved from the other horse, which evolved from another horse, and so forth.
Well, let us consider, say, man, for example. Now, if we go back further in time, according to evolution, man has had a direct ancestor. At the same time, of course, there were, according to the theory of evolution, there were other evolving lines which may have become simply extinct, leaving no evolutionary offspring. But somewhere between man and this hypothetical common ancestor of ape and man, there had to be a series of direct ancestral forms, quite obviously. There could have been parallel evolution taking place, other forms evolving, but obviously there had to be direct ancestors from man all the way back to this ape-like ancestor, whatever it was. So evolution, of course, would require and demand a chain of ancestral forms or evolution. There could be, as I say, parallel evolution going on at the same time. But we should be able to find ancestors, certainly, for many, many creatures if evolution is true. And the intermediate forms or transitional forms would be predicted.
Dr. Gish, may I follow up on a question that Mr. Snyder asked earlier? And in response to that question, you indicated that we have no evidence of present divine creation taking place, that was in the past. If one looks at the system that exists, is it not true that a light year is approximately 5,878,000,000,000 miles, and we have some indication that some stars and systems may be as much as 2 million light years away? The point I'm getting at is that our system is so huge, or the universe, that we may not be able, with our limited equipment, to see what is in space. And is it possible for you who are creationists to take the position that maybe divine creation could be taking place somewhere else? I'm also asking, do you believe that life as we know it, in human beings in particular, is confined to this planet, or is it possible that life exists somewhere else, or is being created somewhere else?
Well, let me say, first of all, Tony, in answer to your question, that science deals with what we can see. What is taking place beyond human observation is not within the realm of science. And so we do not know whether life exists in outer space. I would say that we have no empirical evidence, not a shred of evidence, of course, that it does exist, but we cannot say that it does not exist. Now, if you want my personal opinion, how I just feel about it, I don't believe there is life out there somewhere, but I couldn't say one way or the other. It could exist. God, if by creation God is a sovereign being, he can create life anywhere he so chooses. The evolutionist believes, of course, that if there were other planets similar to the Earth, and they believe there must be other planets quite similar to the Earth, we don't see them, we don't know whether they're there, but it can be safely assumed. The evolutionist believes that there are many planets like the Earth, and if they are there, life has evolved here, surely it must have evolved many other places in the universe.
Some of those individuals, and yet others that are not involved in the question of creation evolution, discuss the idea of UFOs, or unidentified flying objects, as a possible piece of evidence that there might exist life in some other part of the universe. How would you respond to that?
Well, Tony, I believe in UFOs, if we understand what we mean by UFO. By UFO, we mean unidentified flying objects. There are many such objects. But if by UFO we mean something under extraterrestrial control, I believe if the laws of physics are valid, they cannot be under extraterrestrial control. The nearest possible star which might have a planet is Alpha Centauri. It's a system about 30 trillion miles away, and you'd have to go at the speed of light for 5 years to get there. using any known source of energy available in our universe, we can accelerate a spacecraft only to a fraction of the speed of light. In other words, it would take us several thousand years to get to the nearest possible place where we could find a planet, and we have no assurance when we got there there'd be a planet there. And so the idea that these are objects from outer space coming in by ordinary physical processes or some process that is possible or potentially possible in our universe, I don't believe it's possible. I really don't.
Mr. Snyder.
Dr. Gish, I was interested in your response to Mr. McLean. You said empirical science a number of times.
Yes.
And my understanding of empirical science is that which I can see or sense,
yes,
is that which I know exists.
Yes.
I would think you would have great difficulty in accounting for your creator through empirical science.
Yes, that's true. You could not, by the ordinary scientific test, determine the existence of God. However, I believe that there is some evidence, certainly I believe there's tremendous evidence for his existence, which would not be within, say, the ordinary limits of empirical science. But then on the other hand, I believe that through the things that God has made, through the existence of our marvelously structured and complex universe, through the things that He has made, it is possible to discern the unseen attributes of God. That is, eternal Godhead, His creative power and ability. I think we can at least see the evidences for design, purpose, and complexity in our universe, which speaks of planning, speaks of purpose, speaks of intelligence. So I think there are these means. But certainly it is true that both creation and evolution involve a tremendous exercise of faith. I simply believe that there is more evidence for the faith of the creationist than there is for the faith of the evolutionist.
Mr. McLean.
Your thesis is that the major changes from one type to another are not evidenced in the fossil record. And have you any statistical estimates of what percentage of the time period is given by geologists is covered reasonably well by studied fossils? Those that haven't been studied yet don't count, of course.
Yes. Well, of course, geologists, paleontologists, scientists in general have searched out every available formation, major formation, geological formation on the continents, and now through the deep sea research and cores, we are examining material brought up from the depths of the ocean. Certainly the major formations throughout the world have been studied, and all we can say is this, is that the present research, the present evidence available, the present knowledge that we have of these formations fail to produce the transitional forms which we would predict on the basis of evolution. Now, in Darwin's time, of course, Darwin pleaded the poverty of the fossil record. But today, over 100 years later, we can no longer plead the poverty of the fossil record. The fossil record has become almost unmanageably rich. The problem is not finding the fossils, but the problem is finding the transitional forms which are predicted on the basis of evolution theory.
Mr. Burns.
Well, yes, Dr. Gish, in your book here, I want to read a paragraph you had where you said, "What do we find in rocks older than the Cambrian? Not a single indisputable multicellular fossil has ever been found in Precambrian rock. Certainly it can be said without fear of contradiction that the evolutionary ancestor to the Cambrian fauna, if they ever existed, have never been found." What about Dr. Elsa Barnshorn from Harvard, his Gunflint Formation in southern Ontario, where they found literally thousands of fossils of blue-green algae and so forth?
Yes, Barghorn and Schaff and others have found what they believe to be microfossils, that is, the fossilized remains of microscopic single-cell organisms, bacteria and algae. Now, I'm not at present ready to accept all of these reports without question, but let us assume that they are correct. Well, what we have then is the fossilized remains of microscopic single-cell organisms. But of course, there is a monumental gap between a microscopic single-cell organism and the very highly complex animals that are found in Cambrian rocks, the trilobites, the jellyfish, the worms, brachiopods, corals, and sponges of this kind. And so this is what I'm speaking of. We have yet to find, for example, the ancestors of corals and sponges, trilobites, jellyfish. The first time we see a jellyfish, it's a jellyfish. The first time we see a trilobite, it's a trilobite. The first time we see a worm, it's a worm. We just don't have the transitional forms, intermediate forms between these alleged microscopic single-cell forms of life and the very complex creatures that are found in these so-called Cambrian rocks.
And that would still imply that there was life, well, this would date at 2.7 billion years ago, which would certainly mean that life was going on for a long time before the Cambrian period.
Well, yes, if let us assume that these are valid microfossils, let us assume that the date that they assign to these formations is 3 billion years. If that is true, then it would, and if, as I've mentioned, if these are valid microfossils, then one would assume that life was in existence at that time. That would certainly be the assumption, and that, of course, is the assumption made by all evolutionists. And therefore, it is implied, therefore, that these complex animals found in the Cambrian rocks must have arisen from the single-cell organism found in the pre-Cambrian. But the important point is that there is certainly no evidence for this transformation. There is no series of transitional forms, or as a matter of fact, a single, indisputable, multicellular fossil from a pre-Cambrian formation.
Do you think we've really found a large number of the available fossils at this time?
Yes, sir, I certainly do. The fossil record that we do have is a very, very good representation of what is actually in existence. They have searched and searched and searched. As Dr. George Gaylord Simpson has said, he's, of course, one of the world's best-known evolutionists, he says that the search for pre-Cambrian fossils has been intense and disheartening. So the search has been intense, very, very much so. Some evolutionists are beginning to assume that we never will find these, and they are seeking spatial explanations. For example, we find no transitional form between the invertebrates and the vertebrates. And Dr. Omany published a book called The Fishes for Time Life, published this in 1964. And he says in this book there's a 100 million year gap between the invertebrates and the vertebrates, and he says apparently we will never fill that gap. In other words, he's assuming now we will never find the intermediate forms.
But these are soft-bodied formed, and fossilization is an extremely rare event for it to occur. It requires extremely rare things to happen.
Yes,
and these are soft-bodied animals. Couldn't that explain the lack of fossils?
Many have suggested that the reason we don't find Precambrian fossils is that these were all soft-bodied forms. But even as pointed out by George Gaylord Simpson himself, it would be incredible to believe that all of these animals which possess hard parts, which we find in the Cambrian, invented hard parts at the same time. He also points out the fact that their very life existence depends upon the possession of hard parts. And therefore, it would be incredible to believe that they had all evolved from soft-bodied forms, simple soft-bodied forms. So the evidence then seems to be quite certain that the pre-Cambrian animals, or let's put it this way, the evolutionary ancestors, if they existed, of corals and brachiopods and trilobites and creatures like that, must have had hard parts and should have left an excellent fossil record. But even in that case, we do find fossils of soft-bodied forms, the jellyfish, the worms, and as you mentioned, the finds of barghorn and Schaff and others of the microscopic single-cell bacteria certainly were soft-bodied forms, even microscopic in size. And yet, rather numerous reports have been made now of the discovery of these microscopic soft-bodied creatures. It seems to me if we can find fossils of microscopic soft-bodied creatures, we could certainly find the fossils of all of the intermediate forms if they did exist.
Mr. Snyder.
Dr. Gish, I may be beating a dead horse here, but I would like to go on with this fossil record thing. Yes. At least one more question. You said in your book on page 32, it is true that we have as yet uncovered only a small fraction of the fossils that are entombed in the rocks. we have nevertheless recovered a good representative number of the fossils that exist. And I would like to know how you or anybody else could know whether there is a representative number of fossils from a population the size of which you cannot specify.
Yes. Well, I think the best way to answer that is just to note the fact that the kind of fossils that we have been finding for the last 100 years always represent the same kind of fossils that were known to Darwin. We haven't produced any new phyla since Darwin, or classes or anything like that. When we find a fossilized creature, almost immediately the paleontologist can place it in its known phyla, class, order, and so forth. And, of course, we find new species. That is certainly true. But generally, or I should say invariably, these will fit within known categories, phyla, classes, and orders. And so I think it would be safe to say that we do have a representative sampling. Certainly we are going to find new kinds of species. That, I think that's done every year.
Mr. McLean.
As far as the Precambrian fossils, since George Gaylord Simpson wrote the things you quote, the continental drift theory has been accepted. And according to this theory, there is very little ocean bottom left. It's all been destroyed by continental drift, practically without exception, twice over since the start of the Cambrian period.
Yes. According to this idea of plate tectonics and continental drift, which I would emphasize, I have an open mind on this particular idea. By the way, it's not universally accepted. There are quite a number of geologists who are quite reluctant to accept it, but it's become generally accepted. And according to this viewpoint, the oceanic plates are being thrust under the continental plates, and therefore the ocean bottom is being destroyed or recycled, whatever we want to look at it. But the continental, this is not happening to the continental areas. And the continental areas, of course, contain many deposits of marine organisms and so forth. And on the continents, we have all of the so-called geological eras, geological periods are represented, all the way from the Precambrian, Archeozoic, Proterozoic, all the way up to the present time. So we do have these deposits available for study on all the continents. And so to imagine perhaps that these transitional forms may have been there at one time but have been subducted under the continents would not explain the absence of these transitional forms, because we do have the continental deposits which are still with us today.
Mr. Byrne.
Yeah, to change the subject a little bit, Dr. Gish, I was at the San Francisco meeting of the American Association of Biological Sciences in 1972, at which you and your Institute for Creation Research were there. As I remember, there's quite a bit of opposition to your creation research and you people, primarily from the people in California trying to prevent creation being taught or being placed in the school book and being taught as a science. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit, and why you feel that creation should be a part of a biology textbook?
I would be most happy to do that. You see, one of the claims that we frequently hear is that to introduce creation would be to introduce religion. And our present constitutional system demands the separation of church and state. No religion must be taught in the public schools, and I agree with this. But the point is this, is that if our students are exposed to only one viewpoint, that is the evolutionary viewpoint, and it seems to me quite obviously that the only theory of evolution that can be taught, according to the reasoning that is being used, is an atheistic theory of evolution. Because they are saying you cannot bring in God, you cannot bring in the supernatural, that's bringing in religion. Quite obviously, then, you can't teach theistic evolution, because theistic evolution would involve God the Creator. The only thing, then, you can teach according to this definition is a mechanistic, naturalistic, atheistic theory of evolution. Well, that itself, you see, constitutes an indoctrination in a particular philosophy or point of view. Now, our point is this. In order to guarantee academic freedom to guarantee freedom of religion, separation of church and state, that all philosophies must be taught, or all positions, or none at all. And so what we are asking is that along with the theory of evolution, that the evidence for creation be presented to our students, that the fallacies and weaknesses in evolution theory be made known to these students, and that the students then, having been exposed to all the evidence on both sides of the question, then have an opportunity to freely decide on the basis of the evidence that's been presented which one they prefer. Now, I contend that under our present system, our students are actually being brainwashed. They're being indoctrinated in a particular philosophy or viewpoint. And it is a religious viewpoint. For example, I have with me a pamphlet published by the Humanist Community of San Jose, California. And it says, humanism is the belief that man shapes his own destiny. It is a constructive philosophy, a non-theistic religion. And then a little later they quote Sir Julian Huxley, who says, I use the word humanist to mean someone who believes that man is just as much a natural phenomenon as an animal or plant, that his body, mind, and soul were not supernaturally created but are products of evolution, and that he's not under the control or guidance of any supernatural being or beings, but has to rely on himself and his own powers. Unquote. We see this is Huxley's religion. This was his viewpoint, and he did want to establish a humanistic religion based upon evolution. Well, to present that viewpoint exclusively, to exclude the creation viewpoint does then constitute a teaching of a religion or a particular point of view.
But don't you feel that by putting creationism in the school book, this would be teaching a fundamentalist type of religion? In other words, to accept what you're saying, this would mean you'd have to be a fundamentalist to, in other words, believe the Bible literally as so many days of creation and so forth. In which case, by my accepting evolution, this would make me an atheist, which I don't feel I am. I feel I'm a Christian. And
yes, I agree, Mr. Burns, and I want to emphasize very strongly that we are not implying that all evolutionists are atheists. But you can see the viewpoint of Dr. Huxley, and as I have seen, the viewpoint, that is the theory of evolution that is being taught, seems quite clear. It must be aside from God, or God must not be involved, because if you bring in theistic evolution, you are bringing in God. You are bringing in a creator, you see, and that by the definition usually that is applied, then that would be teaching religion. You say, well, to teach spatial creation, for example, we're bringing the fundamentalist viewpoint. Or you can see if it's all right to teach an atheistic point of view, there's nothing wrong with teaching the fundamentalist point of view. But on the other hand, I find that there are many creationists who are not fundamentalist. I find Unitarians who believe that the evidence indicates that our universe must have had a creator. So we find all the way from the Unitarian to the Christian who does accept the concept of creation. So to introduce creation, you see, we are not advocating that the book of Genesis or the Bible or any other religious literature be introduced in the public schools. All we are asking is that the fallacies, weaknesses, what we believe to exist in the evidence for evolution, that this be made known, and that the evidence for creation be given to our students. Now, whether the student is a fundamentalist or whether he's a Unitarian or whatever position he may hold, that's immaterial. We don't want, or we don't believe that we could put the stamp of fundamentalism or liberalism or anything on any particular viewpoint.
of course, I can't accept the fact that a evolutionist is an atheist either.
Yes, that's what I mentioned. I certainly know that there are many, many evolutionists who are not atheists. I know many who are. So you have both kinds. You have theistic evolutionists, you have atheistic evolutionists. So it's not a point then, really. We make the point, exactly the point. It's not a question of religion versus science. It's a question of science versus science. And that is the approach we want to use and to be used in the schools and in the textbooks is simply on the basis of science. What position does the scientific evidence actually seem to support, creation or evolution?
Dr. Gish, I believe I'm correct. This is a two-part question, and I think I'm correct that the creationists are not in total agreement themselves over the creation of the earth in 6 days. Am I correct that one school of thought is that 6 days was, or the time period, I should say, that 6 days was a very long period of history for some, and for others it was literally 6 days as we know it today? That's the first part of the question. And secondly, what school of thought do you adhere to?
Yes. Well, there are different views of creationists on the matter of time, the age of the earth, for example. As you've mentioned, some believe in a day-age position, that days of creation were periods of time embracing geological ages. There are others who hold the so-called gap theory, that there was an original creation of the earth even billions of years ago, and then there was a destruction followed by a recreation. And then there is the position of those who hold to a 6-day creation. And this is a particular position that I hold. Now, we must separate that biblical model of creation, we call it, from the scientific model. You see, scientifically, you could not discriminate between a creation that took place, say, in 6 days, or instantaneously, or 6,000 years, or perhaps even 6 million years. You couldn't discriminate scientifically between a creation that involved one pair of humans or thousands, you see. Scientifically, these are questions that cannot be answered. If it is this so-called biblical model of creation can only be accepted on the basis of revelation. It cannot be tested scientifically. The general creation model, then, is the model that can be compared to the known scientific evidence. Because of the fact that I do accept the biblical revelation is the reason that I accept that position. But I can't prove it scientifically, you see. There'd be no way to demonstrate it scientifically.
Mr. Snyder.
Dr. Gish, in your book you state each kind, and if I remember correctly, it's each kind, as you said,
Yes, sir.
turtles or alligators. Yeah. Each kind was created with a great variety of genes. And in the same paragraph, you go on to talk about racial variation among Homo sapiens, to the extent of saying races exist. And I would like to know, were the races of Homo sapiens created in Genesis, or were they the sons of Noah, or did they arise through time, or something else?
Well, this question of the origin of races is an intriguing question. Let me say, first of all, that evolutionists say today they simply do not have an explanation for the origin of races. Now, the creationists, we cannot prove how races came to be, and we weren't there. But I can offer a suggestion, at least, that the races on the face of the earth today, if you accept the literal historicity of the flood, these races would have to be the offspring of the 3 sons and the 3 daughter-in-laws of Noah. Now, if that is the case, then, in these 6 individuals, they must have been racially mixed individuals. At least they must have the potential for the races. As long as they are freely intermarrying, there is no possibility that races may have arisen. But if they had become scattered, isolated in small groups, then under these circumstances it is possible for races to arise. And I think that is most likely what did happen. Just as among the dogs, for example, we must, by artificial means, we must take these various genetic factors which we know, say the genes towards a long, low dog for the Dachshund, or the collie, the particular genes for the collie or for the retriever. We see these characteristics, we select, we interbreed, and we isolate these particular kinds or types from the others. We do not allow them to freely interbreed. So I believe the origin of races would have required an isolating mechanism of some kind, which by sorting or separating the genetic factors out into small populations and actually having a barrier of some kind, that under these circumstances the races did arise and must have arisen. You had to have some isolated mechanism.
Yeah, one more thing I'm dying to know.
Okay.
In your book, you said in the case of Noah's flood, which you mentioned just a moment ago, you said along with the flood there was mass destruction and a sort of a catastrophic situation. And the flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights, I think it was.
Well, actually, the better part of a year, as a matter of fact.
Oh. Well, I'd love to know where you got that in just a minute, but let me finish this. I want to know, where did all the water come from?
Yes. Well, now, the Bible said, now we're going to the biblical data. And you see, when you go to biblical data, that much of this, like 40 days and 40 nights, that is not verifiable scientifically. We are depending on this biblical source for that particular evidence. Now, as far as the general evidence for a worldwide flood, that is subject to some test. But the Bible says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, that much rain, even though it rained real hard, could not be enough water to flood the entire earth. We believe what has happened, most likely, is that there was a raising of the oceanic floor or level, or the continent or the oceanic levels, and the continental floors dropped. Now, there's enough water right now on the face of the earth to flood the earth to a depth of almost 2 miles if it was perfectly smooth. Then, and this, of course, we believe was responsible for the major part of the flooding. Now, then, following the flood, then, the ocean floors must have dropped and the continental floors must have risen. And as a matter of fact, there is considerable, I would say tremendous, empirical scientific evidence that the ocean floors have dropped. The so-called guyos, or drowned islands. There are landforms now several thousand feet, as much as several thousand feet below the surface of the ocean, which had to be above the surface of the ocean because they are known to have been landforms at one time. There are these vast submarine canyons going off the continental shelf hundreds of miles out to sea, which are now several thousand feet below the surface of the ocean, which many scientists believe had to be eroded under subaerially rather than under the sea. And even just a few months ago, there was an article in Nature in which the scientist was talking about the evidence for this lowering of the Mediterranean and other places. And he asked the question, is there evidence for a concurrent rise? And he mentioned several evidences around the Mediterranean for a concurrent rise of the continental area and also around the Gulf of Mexico and places like that. So there is evidence, there is empirical evidence for this. Whether that evidence has actually had anything to do with the flood, well, that is something we empirically could not know, but I believe it.
One final thing this time around. With all that cataclysm, why did New York capsize?
Well, there's two reasons for it. I think the primary reason is that God was the entire author of this, and he preserved those creatures. Secondly, the ark, the way it was supposedly constructed by the description, it was a very stable structure. It was flat and one of the most stable structures that one could construct. But if the flood was real, if it's historical, it was supernatural from beginning to end. And so God having preserved these creatures that way, he certainly would have enabled them to survive.
Mr. McLean.
Could you give us briefly your estimate of how many years ago the flood was and how many years ago creation occurred?
Well, let us put it this way. Let me say first of all, I don't base my case for creation on any particular age for the earth. I say to anyone, I don't care whether the earth is 10,000, 10 million, or 10 billion years old. I believe the evidence soundly indicates that the universe and what it contains was created, and the fossil record demonstrates this. But if you want my personal viewpoint on the matter, I would incline to believe that the creation took place perhaps thousands of years ago rather than millions or billions of years ago. And may I say that there are many time clocks or chronometers that do indicate a young age for the earth, and there are many reasons for questioning assumptions in the radiometric dating methods. But I would just say this. I really don't care how old the earth, how things are as far as the basic evolution creation question is concerned. I think they're two separate questions.
Mr. Bryant.
Well, there's so many questions I'd like to ask you, and I know we're getting pretty short here, but one I'd like to ask, you implied that evolution can't be seen occurring at this particular time.
Yes.
Garrett Hardin and a number of others feel that the examples of and you mentioned that somebody in your textbook, the pepper moth, the DDT-resistant fly, the penicillin-resistant bacteria, the cyanide-resistant scale insect, are all genuine examples of evolution observed.
Yes, well, first of all, if you have a antibiotic-resistant bacteria, she's still E. coli or Bacillus subtilis, whatever he started out to be. And the same is true of the DDT-resistant flies. They remain fruit flies. Now, in the case of the peppered moths, we've had a shift in population's predominantly light-colored variety to the predominantly dark-colored variety. But in 1850, all of these moths were peppered moths, Biston betularia. In 1976, they remain peppered moths, Biston betularia. They haven't become bumblebees or mosquitoes or houseflies or something like that. They haven't even become a different variety of moth or species of moth. And yet the example of the peppered moth is supposed to be the most striking example of evolution ever seen by man, according to Gavin de Beer and others. Well, if this is the most striking example of evolution ever seen by man, I think it's quite obvious that man hasn't seen evolution.
But this, of course, is the basis of evolution. As the environment changes very subtly and very slightly over a period of time, new species have advantages in this new environment,
right.
and they are selected.
That's the theory, you see, but the point is that is something that no one has ever actually seen happen. The evolutionist says, well, we've only been watching 100 years. Give us 100,000 years, and these minor variations will result in this change. Well, that's what evolutionists do believe. That's what he does accept, but that is something no one has ever seen actually happen.
Evolution also explains stability, too, though. Evolution isn't just change. It
Oh,
also,
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Based upon evolution, you would predict stability and conservation. Of course, you'd predict the same thing on the basis of creation.
With that, Dr. Gish, I want to bring our program to conclusion. I know the panel and I both have numerous other questions we'd like to pursue, but on behalf of all of those that North Idaho College Public Forum, we want to thank you for taking time and being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also thank the panel for outstanding questions. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this dialogue with Dr. Gish about evolution and creation, and thank you for being with us.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording.